Hi, folks.
I should
Okay.
minimize that, or?
Oh, it's all right. I'll step back from it. Okay, welcome to our, I don't know how many of the Patriot Games Forum and why it's called the Patriot Games Forum, but you're here, the important thing. And tonight the issue is, should there be a constitutional convention for the state of New York? Okay, and we have a speaker for pro, Michael Blecker, and con, our own David Sprintzen, and each of them will be speaking about 20 minutes, and then there will be a Q&A after that, and we'll explain the procedure for that at that time. The only other thing I should say, we normally have our forums the fourth Thursday of every month, but next month, because of Thanksgiving, we'll have it on the third Thursday, which I'm told is the 16th of November. We just have the topic. It will be about the Russian Revolution. So, okay. Is there anything else? Does anybody have any comments or any announcements to make? Otherwise, we'll just go. I might as well say before we start this that when we do have the Q&A, we ask you, if you have your questions or comments, to line up on the right side there when the time comes along the wall. And please respect people's time. Sometimes we get people to bloviate for 5 or 10 minutes, and it's not what's there. Please make your questions short, to the terse, and don't waste people's time. Respect both speakers, and now we will hand it over to Michael.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Michael Blecker. I am president and founder of an organization called Politics Reborn. We kind of came out of the Bernie movement, where our mission is to empower community organizers, to kind of give them the tools to help them engage in the political process. A lot of people want to get involved. They want to actually change the way government works, but they don't know how. We kind of try and give them tools and guidance. So that's who I am. I've canvassed in 6 different states for Bernie Sanders. I've helped on various campaigns, stuff like that. So today I'm going to talk about why I am supporting ConCon. And forgive these slides and everything if they're not the prettiest or most aesthetic looking or the most complete. One of the good things about these slides, though, is I do have links for all the different facts that, or statements that are expressed on this, and anyone is welcome to actually get a copy of the PowerPoint after. So, first thing I want to talk about is the common myths about the Constitutional Convention. So, before we even get into why people like myself are voting yes, I want to talk about why a lot of people are right now saying no, and talk about how a lot of the stuff is misinformation, distortions, a lot of things that just aren't completely true. So the first thing is, you've heard many different times you can lose your pension from us having a state constitutional convention. This is not true. This is unequivocally false. Okay, the reason why this is false is because in our state constitution, we see pensions as contracts. Okay, that was established in 1938. Because we see pensions as contracts, federal protection kicks in immediately. Okay, so federal protection in the Constitution, the federal Constitution, right, there's something called the contract clause, right? So the contract clause means that no state government can renege or invalidate or change a contract once it exists. So anyone who has current pensions, anyone who has pensions that they're retiring and living off, that can't be changed regardless of what happens in the state constitution. In fact, the only way it can change is actually if the government one day says it doesn't have financial ability to pay for the pensions. That actually is constitutional. That other states have done that. Detroit, we all know about, right? That happened. But in places like Illinois, when they tried to change pensions, they didn't show that they were in any sort of financial distress, and it was ruled unconstitutional. Why? Because again, it's seen as a contract. They can't just change that. Any constitutional scholar, any Supreme Court judge, they're very famous ones, Peter Gailey, who will talk about that. I cite him. Another myth is that it will cost over $350 million. The Constitution will not cost over $350 million or anywhere close to that amount. This is something that has been spreading like crazy, where the convention will cost tons of money with taxpayer money. That is not the case, as we'll get to actually the next slide on the political insiders, right, will make up 80% of delegates at the past convention, and it won't be any different now, right, because that was what happened in 1967, or so they claim. The legislature has amended the Constitution over 200 times, so we don't really need a convention to change our state constitution. And dark money and lobbyists and groups like the Mercers and Koch brothers are being behind the yes side of having a convention. So let's actually go through each of those myths. So as I stated with the pensions, right, you cannot lose your pensions. The U.S. Constitution, right, has a provision known as contract clause. So there are cases that try to do this. It can't happen. Additional myths. I don't know if it's big enough. Ah, there we go. Wow. There we go. Is that better?
That's good.
All right, so additional myths, right? So collective bargaining. You cannot lose collective bargaining rights from the Constitutional Convention. The collective bargaining that's in the actual Constitution, right, it's not guaranteed by the state constitution. The right to collective bargaining is actually protected by something called the Taylor Law. The Taylor Law is something that was passed in the state legislature. Also, the collective bargaining as it is, right, in the Constitution, it doesn't, it contains no reciprocal obligation on the part of the government employees to negotiate with worker organizations. Health benefits, again, they are not protected by the state constitution. There's no constitutional protection that would take them away. So again, the cost of the convention would not cost $350 million. This is a gross exaggeration. They've done a bunch of different estimates. It would go anywhere between 40 to 100 million, and even that is very generous. There are people who have even said that it might cost something like $15 million. To give you an idea how much that really is, that's 1/10 of 1% of our New York State's annual budget. So when people like say, it's gonna cost so much money, again, it's really not going to cost that much money. Empirical evidence has shown that most delegates in past conventions were not what they call political insiders. So the whole idea that 80% of the delegates in 1967 were political insiders, no, this is not the case, okay? So actually only 13 delegates out of, I think it's 186 were current state legislatures, and a couple dozen or more were former state legislatures. The term political insiders, they use that to basically count anyone who ever has kind of been involved in public office service. So yes, if you want to say that anyone who ran and was elected was once or after the convention a judge or someone who had worked in the public administration, they would be political insiders. But that's the whole point of elections. People aren't going to be elected, out of chance. They actually have to have served their community in some way, have done public service, have some sort of election background and political background.
Really? Like in Washington?
In Washington, D.C., well, Trump's a great example, though. Even Trump, right? He had name recognition, though. Well, you need to have something. You can't just run. Like the people who ran and won as legislatures, they had name recognition. It can't just be out of the hat. So this idea that they were political insiders is kind of distorted in a lot of ways. Over 200 amendments have been passed since 1894, when the Constitution was actually the last one was written. So people always say, well, we don't need a Constitution, the system's working. Problem is the amendments that they talk about, they don't actually focus on structural reform. It doesn't actually address the big issues of New York State, which I will be talking about. It focuses on trivial stuff. In fact, one of the amendments that is up this year that you guys will be voting on, I think it's Prop 2, it has to do with basically allowing certain highways in the Catskills and the Adirondacks and areas that are protected by Forever Wild protection. What? That's Prop 3? Sorry, Prop 2 is the pensions?
Pensions taken away for the felonies.
No problem. The Koch brothers and the Mercer family, even though there is that claim, we have not seen any sort of dark money when it comes to coming from them. The Mercer family has stated they're neutral. As of now on the Constitutional Convention, they may have a different view if it passes or not. When it comes to the spending, we actually see that the spending is much more favorable towards the support group, as in the people who are supporting no. So the people who are voting no, if you go to campaign finance records, Board of Elections, stuff like that, political articles, you'll see that they've raised and spent a lot more millions of dollars. In fact, really one of the biggest reasons why we're even competing to an extent is there's a person by the name of Bill Samuels who's kind of a good government advocate who's putting a decent amount of funding of his own to help change the Constitution. So getting beyond the mess, let's talk about Albany's structure and dysfunction. I encourage everyone, if possible, if they get a chance to ever read a book called 3 Men in a Room by Seymour Lockman, or his updated version, Failed State. It really goes into the specifics, because even if you're pro or against the Constitution, you should understand that Albany is one of the most dysfunctional places in America, if not the most dysfunctional. And that's something...
How do you spell Seymour's last name?
Lachman. So he was a former...
The title is what?
3 Men in a Room, and the newer updated version is Failed State. Nope.
Can you explain what 3 Men in a Room refers to?
Yeah, so I'll get to that, don't worry.
I think I need to say something here. Please save your comments and questions till later. It disturbs the flow. And just make note of that. And you'll have a chance to ask questions or make your points later. Thank you.
So one thing that I will say that's kind of interesting when it comes to the Constitutional Convention is there's no one I've ever heard who says they're support or against it because government is working fine in New York. The argument being made actually against having a Constitutional Convention is the same argument kind of being made for it, and that is we don't trust people to do the right thing in New York. And there's some reasons to have cynicism. So let's talk about 3 Men in a Room. That's the name that's often used to refer to as Albany, right? So the way Albany works is there are kind of 3, now it's actually 4 men with the IDC that kind of are in the room that make pretty much all the decisions. Everything from the budget to where charter schools are located to which guns will be legal, which guns won't be legal. They kind of make the decisions, even when it comes to who gets on what committee and stuff. Rank and file legislatures, the people you vote for, don't really have a lot of power in the legislature. They can do absurd things. So like, for instance, give people less than a 48-hour notice to vote on a bill. So the rank and file literally will have less than 48 hours to vote on a bill. They can make the life miserable for people who don't get in line and do what's best for the party leaders. So, for instance, one article that I cite where he talks about how they removed them from a committee after he didn't support something. Seymour Lockman, who wrote the book, who was a state senator for decades, he talks about the same experience, to the point that the people the 4 men in the room, even control how many offices you'll get. So it's a huge competition, and where the offices will be located. Because, right, if you want to win re-election, you don't want your office located in the middle of nowhere, where it's super far from many of your constituents. Or if you have a really gerrymandered type area or an area really spread out, you want 2 offices. So this kind of stuff continues to happen, and it makes it very hard to pass bills. In fact, we are the worst when it comes to passing bills in the nation. So, ethic laws in Albany are also blurry. We all know about Albany, and especially in Long Island, the amount of people that have gone to jail over the years. In fact, we're considered the most corrupt state. Over the past decade, more than 30 elected official state holders have either been convicted, accused, or sanctioned of wrongdoing. That's the most. The ethic laws in the state are really blurry. I don't know how many of you are familiar with things like the LLC loophole, but pretty much New York's campaign finance laws have it where a business can provide $60,000 to candidates, okay? Many states, I think 38 states, have campaign finance laws. None are that generous when it comes to the amount of money you can give to candidates. It's not even close. The average is $5,000 when you take all the other states. In fairness, there are states like Texas that have no campaign finance laws, so I guess we have some progress. So, right, Albany doesn't pass much legislation, as I previously said. Over a 5-year period, from 1997 through 2001, 11,474 bills reached the floor of the two houses. Not a single one was voted down. The legislature held public hearings on less than 1% of the major laws it passed. When those laws made it to the floor for a vote, more than 95% passed with no debate. There are really no hearings on the bills before they pass. There's no really transparency on the bills. And if you actually take the percent of the bills, I'll put the article, but if you take the percent of the bills that have passed over the years, but the Brennan Justice Center did a really good study on, it's significantly less than in most other states. So not only do bills really pass without any debate, but much less do. And often it's actually the state Senate we see these days, right? We all know about the IDC, right? Blocking bills. So like tons of bills have been blocked recently. The healthcare, environmental bill of rights. Those things aren't passing. They often don't even get to come up to the vote because the party leaders, the people who control the legislature, get to pick. Other issues with New York. Yes, it goes beyond Albany when it comes to our dysfunction. Our court system is incredibly complex and disorganized. How bad is it? So bad that estimates say that we lose over $500 million annually for the inefficiencies. That's because of the state constitution and the way it was written. New York is constitutionally required to provide its citizens with an education to the high school level, right, that teaches basic literacy, calculating, verbal skills, all that. The problem, though, with this is New York, once again, there's no fiscal equity. So what we see in New York is a lot of have and have-nots in our school system, right? There's an $8,601 are spent per pupil gap between the state's wealthiest and poorest school districts, the 5th largest gap in the nation. And fun additional fact, actually, New York spends the most of taxpayer money, actually, compared to every other state on public school funding, so per pupil. And even though that is the case, we don't actually see effectiveness because some schools get a lot of money and other schools get very little, to the point that certain schools didn't even have enough money to afford art teachers. I think it was 1/5 of the schools. Going beyond that, how dysfunctional is New York? Well, we're also dysfunctional in our abortion law. So, New York's abortion law is predated Roe v. Wade. It was passed before the Roe v. Wade decision was made, and because of that, it hasn't been updated because it requires an amendment. So, late-term pregnancies can only occur in the state of New York if the woman's life is in danger, not if the woman's health is in danger. That's the way it works in the Supreme Court. Because of this ambiguity, many people have either been forced to leave the state to perform an abortion, or yes, people have actually lost their lives or died. There's articles from Jezebel and other places that talk about this for several years. We were hoping this year an amendment would pass. It didn't get done. Cuomo actually stated off the record to certain people that he doesn't think it's ever going to pass. The home rule. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the home rule, but this is another issue. So the state constitution has it where basically there's this huge complexity of what the local government can do and what the state government can do, and often kind of a battle between the local and state. I come from New York City, which is a great example. You constantly see de Blasio and Cuomo fighting over certain things. You see our city council passing certain things, but then the state saying you can't do that. One fun fact about the home rule, right, is New York places more underfunded mandates on localities than any other state in the nation. So often laws are passed, state pass certain mandates that local governments have to do, but they don't provide them the funding to actually make it possible. And then the last thing, when it comes to the weird, archaic stuff of New York, our good old voting laws, which I love the most of all. So I started off with the Bernie Sanders campaign. To vote for Bernie Sanders for the April primary, you've had to have registered as a Democrat by October 9th of 2015. Okay, October 9th of 2015 to vote in an election that takes place in April 19th, the year after. I don't even think Trump had yet announced by October 9th of 2015 if he was running or not. Okay, we have by far the worst when it comes to that. There's no other state like that where it's that many days before the actual election. We also have No early term voting, no same day registration voting. It's really a real pain to even do absentee voting where you have to actually mail the Board of Elections and stuff. The incumbency rate is really, really bad in New York, okay? So you're more likely to die in office than to lose re-election, okay? Which, again, is really, really bad. In fact, fun fact, I know it's really warped, but when you see someone actually die in office, you see a bunch of people kind of jump and run, like where it becomes a 5-person race, because they all know whoever wins that, they have that seat for a lifetime. Or fairness, I actually should correct it, more likely to die or be convicted than, so that's the other thing. So you may not die, you may just go to jail. Other voting restrictions. So the Board of Elections is controlled by the 2 major parties. So the Board of Commissioners of the Board of Elections and all the way down to our rank and file are controlled by the Republican and Democratic Party. They get to pick our 10 commissioners. The ballot access laws, how many of you, had anyone ever run for anything, ever for office in New York? Ain't it fun? You get to ask a bunch of random people, will you sign my petition and everything? That is incredibly antiquated. New York's ballot access laws make no sense. You basically are tied in court constantly because the establishments will challenge your ballots for really odd, tedious things, like they'll say, the signatures weren't legitimate. It used to be, even, I kid you not, you had to actually get the signatures on a certain color paper, okay? And then the court ruled that is unconstitutional, but it used to be where Republicans had to do pink paper, if I remember, and Democrats green paper. Yes, which I always love, Republicans and having to petition with pink paper is just a fun fact. So it makes it really hard for us to actually get grassroots candidates because of the petitioning process. The petitioning process is really convoluted, really complicated. There are like 5 election lawyers in all of New York State, pretty much, that all cost a ton of money to really make sure your petitions are nice and clean and protected. And one of the things is that you see is that the Board of Elections make these rules to kind of protect their own candidates. Another big thing is we are 46 in voter turnout in the country. Okay, and when it comes to primaries, it's even worse. Okay, the turnout is awful. There was a primary recently in all of New York. The turnout was abysmal. Like, there are candidates in a lot of areas that aren't even running against opposition. There are people like Sima Felder, who last year ran on the Conservative Party, the Republican Party, and the Democratic Party. He ran on all 3 ballot lines. So, let's see, did I miss anything? Registration. That's pretty much it when it comes to election laws and incumbency rate and everything. So what have previous conventions given us? And this I needed to expand to be fair, but there are other things. So worker protection. So the 1938 convention gave us a lot of the protections when it came to things like pensions and stuff like that. Social welfare and basic education. That all came out of the Constitution. The forever wild protection, right? So the forever wild protection is a clause in the Constitution that protects certain lands, right, from kind of being invaded or disturbed in any way or changed in any way. I'm trying to think of a better way of articulating that. That's it. That's the other thing. It also made it where it allowed the Blaine Amendment to exist, right? So the Blaine Amendment is in the Constitution, allows it where religious schools aren't funded by taxpayer money. So all these things came out of the Constitution. And in fact, even in the 1967 convention, there were some good things that came out of it. It just didn't pass because they put it all in one bill. But things like having an independent commission. So when it comes to districting, so redistricting. So right now the legislators get to choose how the districts are. So New York is one of the most gerrymandered places because we don't have an independent commission. And yes, there is a bill that passed. There was an amendment that was created to change that, but it's not really true reform because the independent commission that they created gets to be picked by the legislature. So instead of the legislature just doing it directly, so it looks like reform. So for all these reasons, we are saying yes to a constitutional convention. There are other things that I could talk about, things like property tax issues. One of the biggest issues in all of New York State is actually a property tax makes no goddamn sense. It's actually the most complex of all 50 states. It costs the state and a lot of people a lot of money every year. It actually hurts low-income people much more with the way the property tax is unequal. And it's actually because our Constitution has these like arbitrary rules of caps and stuff like that. The other thing I could talk about is when it comes to pensions, one thing to keep in mind is, God forbid ever our pensions are not as fully funded or if there's tons of corruption, the government, the state government can claim one day that fiscally they're not able to pay for pensions. And over time, you actually have seen that. They've used that to convince people to keep creating tiers, right? So I think we're now at 6 different tiers. So the oldest generation gets the most benefits from the pensions, and they have the strongest protections. And over time, that only takes a majority vote in the legislature in Cuomo. So we don't have anything, we have no control on that. So what the Constitution would be is if we vote yes, in 2018, we would have 3 delegates selected in each Senate district, okay? And a lot of people will tell you, well, we'll favor the Republicans, but the Senate districts are, majority of the Senate is Democrat. If you include the IBC, majority of the Senate is Democrat. And if you look at the elections over and over again, the Republican districts are much more competitive than Democrat. Because we get 3 per Senate district, what you're going to see is a lot of Democrat districts that have all 3 blue people being sent, right? And a lot of Republican districts where you'll see 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat, or 2 Democrats, 1 Republican, and some districts where you'll see 3 Republicans. Not to mention, we also then get to like 15 at-large delegates. That's state delegates. So the 15 at-large delegates would be people that are running kind of across the whole state ballot. Republicans don't have that many good candidates to run on the state level. This is the weakest time the Republican Party has ever been. They don't have the governor. They don't have New York City mayor. They're barely holding on to the Senate. We have an overwhelming majority in the Assembly. This is the bluest New York's going to get. I think over 45 out of 63 districts went to Hillary Clinton. And that was actually worse than Obama. I think Obama won 50-something Senate districts. So we're going to get a good amount of progressive and Democratic people in there. And the greatest thing of all is it will be in 2018 when we get to select the delegates. A nice year for us because it will hopefully have a decent turnout because congressional elections will be up. And a lot of people are kind of pissed with the crazy guy in the White House. And no matter what happens at the convention, we get to vote on it again. So whatever changes are made in 2019 or 2020, depending on how long the convention takes, we get to choose us, the people, if we approve or don't approve. So let's say the convention, they pass all sorts of horrible things. We still have to then vote for it. You know, so for all those reasons, I support the Constitutional Convention. I urge you all to turn over your ballot on November 7th and vote yes. Thank you so much for listening. Hopefully it wasn't too painful and boring.
Thank you, Michael. And now, we'll turn it over to David.
I will avoid the use of video. Let me say that I appreciate your commitment to Bernie's campaign, and there are some good government people who are, such as Michael, in favor of a constitutional convention, and I would call them the naive optimists. But I appreciate it and I recognize it. But if you look at the organizations that are in fact involved in the campaign for and against, you find relatively few that are in favor of it, but usually to a significant extent, those are much more conservative organizations. The Bar Association is in favor, Newsday is in favor, the Long Island Association of Commerce and Industry is in favor. And then if you look at the organizations that are opposed, it is basically the vast majority of grassroots community organizations. I've never seen organized labor as well organized and as unified as it is here. There is not one union that I'm aware of in the state of New York. There may be one, but I'm not aware of any, that is not opposed to having a constitutional convention. The environmental organizations are opposed almost entirely. I don't know of any that are not. And the vast majority of community organizations, including Hispanic and African American organizations. I think there is a reason about that. And I think the reason, there are many dimensions to that reason, but I do think that the overriding sense here is a sense of how trustworthy you are at the present political climate. We can talk about the details, and I do want to talk about those. About corruption. You can list all the things that it would be nice to have in the convention. Many of them, by the way, are legislative matters. They're not constitutional matters, having to do, for example, like the Blaine Amendment, right, and having to do with, that is in the Constitution. The provision against funding private schools is in the Constitution, parochial schools. That could be taken out. I mean, there are some interesting protections in the New York State Constitution which we should be aware of and which could be threatened. Let me just read a few of them, just a few. Civil service appointments by competitive exam. Retirement benefits not to be diminished or impaired. State money not to be loaned to private corporations. State assistance against the hazards of unemployment, sickness, and old age. All right? Guaranteed right for public employees to form a union. Right? One could, for example, conceive of a right to life provision put into a new constitution. Forest preserved to be kept there forever wild. The aid and care support of the needy. Protection of natural resources. Low rent housing and nursing home accommodations for persons of low income. Right? There are, and the other one, as I said, the maintenance and support of a system of free common schools wherein all the children of the state may be educated. And use of public property or money in aid of denominational schools is prohibited. All right. There are many there, and there are others. Those just list a few key ones. So there are some very good protections. All right. There are obviously ways that one could easily conceive of improving it. I can think of many. You mentioned some. There's no question about it. And if I were confident in the likely results of a constitutional convention, I would be in favor of it, right? But the present political climate is not one which I think gives people, and progressives particularly, a great deal of confidence in the likely results, especially after Citizens United. Now, there was reference, for example, to Robert Mercer and his people Reclaim New York as under the aegis that he operates. We see him now in the newspapers right now going after the Suffolk budget, and tomorrow he'll be going after the Nassau budget. It's in the papers the last couple of days, by the way, if you haven't paid attention. But yes, and he says right now that they have taken no position. But what do you think will happen if there is a constitutional convention? You realize that the right wing in America is organized now to have a constitutional convention at the United States level to change the American Constitution, and they are 2 states away from getting there. Right? They control basically 32 states in this country, with having the entire legislature and the governorship. Right? They are explicit about their efforts to control 34 states, and then to create a national constitutional convention. Right? Right? And when you have a constitutional convention, it's not that you go there to make a change of this or that legislation. Everything is up for grabs. They can choose to change 1 thing, 2 things, 3 things. They can choose to write the whole thing over again. The real estate industry can decide, we want to get a hold of the Adirondacks. Or Central Park, for that matter. Right? I'm sure there are people who would love to have that. Right? There are the problem with the 1967 Constitution Convention, which was defeated after they made their proposals, is number one, it was one package, and it was one package that was presented, not separate. Now, we didn't vote on each separate one, but it was one package, and it was one package because the aim that was really central for the Catholic Church was to get the right to fund parochial education, and they figured they were most likely to succeed if they could pack that in with everything else, including some of the good things that you correctly mentioned. Unfortunately, that was defeated 67 to 33 or something. Right? the Catholic Church, of course, and other parochial schools, not to speak of charter schools, which are being funded through legislation, could be guaranteed in a changed constitution. Do you think the charter school movement is not well funded, right? Especially by millionaires at Wall Street, and would not be actively involved in trying to guarantee, destroy public education? I mean, if anything, that the attack on public schools and unions of public schools is pervasive and systemic in this state. It's been continuous. It's one of the fundamental things that really motivates Newsday, who has come out and given all those same arguments you've given as to why we should have a Constitutional Convention. Right? So there are real dangers here. It's not like, well, it would be nice to try it out. Let's see what'll happen. All right? Now, again, if I were optimistic, I would come to a different conclusion, but I am not optimistic in the present climate. Right? I'm not optimistic at all. All right? So, think of the things that we have there and the possibilities. Now we can talk about how. I know Howard Samuels, talks about a people's convention. He's had some very beautiful ads on television, for example, about a people's convention. And wouldn't it be nice? And you started listing all the things that we could have, and let's get away from the corrupt politicians in Albany and the three men in the room, and let's get the people there. Well, all right, let's talk about running for office. Are you going to run for office? All right, against the politicians with name recognition, or people with money paid for by Bannon and Mercer? Go ahead. It's a free country. I mean, get your 3,000 signatures or 1,500, depending whether you got a party or you don't have a party. All right? I mean, so a lot of it comes really down to trust. I mean, it's in a sense, and what you're willing to take, to put up for grabs. Now, we do have another way of doing it. Right? As you mentioned, for example, you talked about if we decide to have it, we will then vote on the proposals. You said in 2018, delegates, and then we vote on the proposal in 2019 or 2020. You're right, because there's no limit to how long that could last. So how can you say how much you know it's going to cost, right? Because we don't know how long it's lasts. It's up to the convention to determine its rules, right? And to decide how much it wants to revise, and then how it wants to present its information to the voters, whether separately or in packages. Right? So we can't really say how much it's going to cost, but it will cost a lot. Will it cost $350 million, or will it cost $50 million? I mean, I don't really know. I mean, if you're in favor of having the Constitutional Convention, you say it's going to be not that expensive at all, 0.1% of the state budget. If you're not in favor of it, you're going to, like Flanagan said, it's going to cost $350 million. Right? I don't know what it's going to cost. It'll cost a lot. But we can amend the Constitution at no cost. And we are doing it this time. Right? And we're doing it not just for the trivial thing of upstate, of facilitating the development of roads in the preserve areas of the Adirondacks. We're doing it to give judges the capacity to take away the pensions of corrupt and convicted officials. That's a big thing. Those people up in Albany didn't want to do that. They were forced to do that. Right? That costs us nothing. And we can do it piece by piece. Right? Now, I mean, is it easy to do? Of course not. Right? It's not easy to do. Right? But from my point of view, the best way to change what is really wrong in the state of New York is to get the Democrats in control of the state Senate. We're closer to that, and that's not quite so risky. I don't want to build the Democrats up to be the greatest things in the world. And a lot of things that they say in the assembly, if they really thought it was going to get passed, you'd have to push them a little harder. Right? But when the Democrats did have control for just 2 years, several years ago, it got a bad press on Long Island for a couple of reasons, but that's when we got the millionaire's tax, for example. We got a whole bunch of really progressive legislation in those 2 years. Right? Even with a corrupt Democratic state Senate leader who's now in jail. Right? That's one of many. Right? So there's no question there's corruption. But I don't see why you expect corruption to disappear if you change the Constitution. I mean, corruption is a continual challenge and a continual problem. We got to deal with it. But I mean, I think this amendment, which I recommend you vote in support of, amendment number 2, right? Yes, give the judges the capacity to remove the pensions of corrupt and officials who have been convicted. Right? There are many more amendments that we can engage in and pursue, and it'll be much easier if we can change a couple more Republican state senators and give the Democrats and Andrea Stewart Cousins, the Democratic leader who is, the state Senate who is not corrupt, the capacity to lead the state Senate. I think that is a much more doable and a much more reliable way to address the significant problems we have. And can be done, and we're committed to doing it. And many of the things that we're talking about, like public financing of elections, which is something that my organization, Statewide Citizen Action, has been working on and leading the campaign for the last 15 years, we're about as close as we've ever been. Of course, the bloc is, without question, is the Republican control of the state Senate, with obviously assistance from Jeff Klein and his breakaway Democrats. That's a real problem. It's a challenge. It's a political reality. Right. But it is important to appreciate, and don't make a lot about it, to make important to appreciate. Number one, there are some very good protections in the New York State Constitution. Number two, if we have a Constitutional Convention, everything is up for grabs. Number three, it's not enough to say all the things you would like to have. Right? It's equally or more important to say how you're going to make sure that's going to happen and how the alternatives are not going to happen and how you're going to guarantee that you're going to get public candidates who are responsive to the public as opposed to candidates run by the parties, right? Run by the wealthy and the powerful, right? Who have very particular interests. Those are things that, I mean, if you feel confident about that, go to it. But I don't think the present climate is one that should leave one to be highly confident, right? And let me say a few other things. I don't have to get too much into the weeds. I mean, we can talk about the election procedures, right, and how you get on the ballot, and things like that. I don't think that's really, we need to dwell upon that now. But there's some of the other things which I care about, and people don't talk too much about. But I know, for example, Newsday is a good example of that, who is really committed to getting rid of fusion voting, right? New York State is one of 6 states or 7 states that has fusion voting, right? What is fusion voting? Fusion voting is the situation in which a candidate can run on more than one party, and the votes add up, so that that is not a spoiler arrangement. Newsday hates that, and that also points to the corruption, legitimately, all right, of Ed Walsh, who's now in jail with the Conservative Party, and the cross ballots that you referred to. You didn't mention, by the way, that this guy was on the Working Families Party, because he wasn't. Right? You're referring to Sigmund Feldman in Brooklyn. Right, he wasn't on the Working Families Party. Right, that's important to understand, underline, right? Yes, the Republicans and Democrats often make deals around their judge candidates and to guarantee people jobs, but the Working Families Party has a leverage here because it is independent and committed to promoting progressive politics. And fusion voting is the closest that our kind of political system approaches to the parliamentary kind of opportunities that most other societies have, namely multi-party elections. Fusion voting is the closest thing to that. And it has been, there's nothing in the U.S. Constitution which denies it, but the U.S. Supreme Court legitimated the right of state parties to get rid of fusion voting because party leaders don't want to have that challenge. Right? That's what the Supreme Court did that about 20 years ago in a case around Michigan, Minnesota, I believe it was, right? Which really undercut the effort to create an effective progressive third party around this country. It was called the New Party, right? And that's where the Working Families Party comes out of, by the way, right? But so now the Working Families Party is trying to build a left-wing political party across the country, but it has to do it very differently in most states. It has to work as a party within the Democratic Party, precisely because fusion voting doesn't exist. And only in a few states, New York, Connecticut, primarily, have fusion voting. It allows a progressive party such as ours, I am a Working Families Party state committeeman, right, to promote progressive candidates and to leverage our position by pushing the Democrats, right, to run more progressive candidates, right? And if they don't do it, right, we don't give them their support. We can even run an opponent to undermine them, right? And we can run our own candidates and leverage that and get them to support us, as we have done, and as what happened with Kate Browning and as a Working Families Party elected official in the Suffolk legislature, all right? So, but it is something which the establishment is very much opposed to. All right? They say that, Newsday constantly says, get rid of fusion voting, right? Because so to give everybody a chance, right, by running either into the candidates, all that does is it divides and conquers. It makes third parties such spoilers. Of course, I may offend some people here to say that the worst spoiler of all is the Green Party in the state of New York. And that's because they basically only run candidates of any significance when there's a potential progressive alternative, and as they're doing in Nassau County now, as they did with the Todd Kaminsky race in the South Shore a few years ago, and as they are doing now with the county executive in Nassau County. Fortunately, they're so impotent that they haven't really made a difference, and they haven't cost us the national election the way Ralph Nader did in 2000. All right? But the point is that fusion voting allows a progressive organization to stand for something and to use its power and leverage to try and move the established parties. And I used to think that that would be another thing that might well go. All right? The effort to remove that is something which the established political parties really want to do, because they don't like to have to deal. Now, of course, they can do it in corrupt fashion, and that's certainly what happens between the Republicans and the conservatives. There's no question about that. It wasn't fusion voting that created corruption, right? But they don't do it with the Working Families Party. So there are significant protections, and there are some things which are really quite good about the New York State Constitution. But I think the main point I would want to say right here, and we can have a discussion about all the details, so I won't go on any longer than this. The main point is, do you feel confident in the current political environment that you think that progressive politics is likely to win out? I wish I could say I did, but unfortunately I don't.
How long's my rebuttal?
Oh,
Or do I provide a rebuttal or just?
yeah, take 5 minutes.
Go ahead.
All right, just 5 quick minutes, and I'll try to make it fast. That has been used in 1997, and that has been used in 1977 to say no to the convention, okay? As in, it's not the right time. Can't be done. When it comes to the budget and how much it will cost, yes, nothing is based in fact. But this is like saying that climate change isn't real. We base things on projections. We base things on empirical evidence. We use budget analysis and what has happened in past conventions to kind of predict what will happen in future conventions. We make that assessment of how much it will cost at the convention based on the fact that all the past conventions haven't cost that much. And they ended in less than a year. Now, when it comes to the unions, and I love my union brothers and sisters, but at the end of the day, there is a difference between the unions of today and the unions that Eugene Debs envisioned, okay? if you go down the list of the candidates that they've endorsed over the years, if you go down the list of the candidates that even the Working Families Party has endorsed, you will see there's not much of a difference between them and the Democratic Party. They talk about how they don't make backroom deals. They made a backroom deal when it came to Cuomo, so Teach-Out. They wouldn't get Teach-Out's endorsement. It was a huge problem. Many people were disappointed that they didn't support Howie Hawkins, who was running on the Green Party ticket and actually had a decent amount of support. Okay, so when it comes to the fusion voting and stuff like that, I am actually against fusion voting. I think the idea that people running on multiple ballot lines is absurd. The whole point of having different political parties is to have different candidates. The fact that we have candidates running on 3 or 4 political parties makes no sense to me. When it comes to the third parties being spoilers, I'm sorry, they're not spoilers. Okay, we have a voting turnout that is a joke. No one is voting. No one cares for the Democratic Party. No one cares for the Republican Party. Why? Because our lives aren't improving. You think Trump just became president out of nowhere? Because people are sick of the way the system is. It's not working. We need something different. We need something new. You're talking about 9% of people in the primaries chose our final nominees with Trump and Hillary Clinton. Now they base it on, well, we should be against the convention because, well, we don't know what's going to happen, or that will take over. This is true for every election. What we're saying is we shouldn't vote at all. I'm sorry, elections right now, the system is broken, yes. Money has a problem when it comes to elections. But what we're saying is we shouldn't fix a rigged system because the rigged system is broken. That's what we're telling people. And when it comes to me, I am very disappointed at the no vote when it comes to idealism. People, this is a state constitution. You're not risking your limbs, you're not risking your lives. The civil rights movement, people went down south registering voters. People fought for workers' rights. There were riots, people went to jail, and what we're talking about right now here is, could be taxpayer money. Yes, if we want to actually improve the system, if we want to fight for universal health care, it's going to take a real fight. Tommy Douglas didn't just pass universal health care in Canada, he got a lot of crap for it. Okay, if you want to actually change the system, yes, you're going to have to take a lot of risk. When it comes to the Constitutional Convention, all the empirical evidence suggests and all the projections suggest that not only is there actually not that many risks, but the rewards are much greater, but the structure will still be in place. Even if we elect and got rid of all the IDC tomorrow, there's nothing to prevent 4 other people or 3 other people from going rogue one day and saying, you know what? I'm just going to hold up the state Senate and not pass any bills. That happened. The IDC happened. There are new people running the IDC, but it happened before them. Malcolm Smith and them started the idea of the IDC. So the structure isn't different. And as for beating the IDC and having a Democratic Senate, we've had a Democratic Senate before. Not much has changed. We have a city council that's overwhelmingly Democrat. We have de Blasio in New York City that's a mayor who, by the way, if you talk to actually a lot of communities of immigrants and communities of color, they're not happy with the broken windows policy. They're not happy with the close relationship they have with real estate. That's the Democrats. If we think that the Democratic Party is any different in a lot of ways than when it comes to the money interests of the lobbyists, we're sadly mistaken. So, and then the last thing I would say, look, I'm all for, getting rid of the Jeffrey Kleins of the world, but it's even harder to do that. They're incumbents. These people have high approval ratings. Tony Abella is very liked in my state Senate district. And because of the gerrymandering, it's even harder to beat them. So that's my spiel. Please vote yes.
Just one note, I won't dwell upon all these things. There was not a backroom deal with respect to Cuomo. I know, because I was there. It was a fantastically open convention. It was remarkable in the quality of the dialogue and the discussion and the struggle. Zephyr was really excellent in the way she dealt with herself and handled it, and there was a great deal of support for her there, but it was an agreement, and I could talk to you about the details of the agreement and what it involved and what Cuomo was committed to, much of which he didn't keep up to, I must tell you. But it was not a backroom deal. It was quite open, and it was one of the rare occasions where you actually had a convention in which the decisions were made open in the convention. It was really quite exciting time to be there. But let's have questions and let's have discussion.